All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Levi Kiesecker. I am a natural resource scientist with the Washington Conservation Commission. Thanks for joining us for our session this morning with NRCS's Conservation Effects Assessment Project and the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework folks. I think we have folks still kind of joining, but I'm going to get going now because we have quite a bit to cover this morning. So this is what the agenda looks like. I'm going to just talk for like 15 minutes to kind of introduce what we're here to discuss and kind of an overview. Just real quick, a couple like practical notes. The webinar is recorded right now, is being recorded. Thank you, Jan, for that. Jan Thomas with the Center for Technical Development is here. Thank you, Jan, to also help keep things running smooth, grease the wheels. I think Jan and I are going to monitor for hands. If folks have questions, raise your hand, put something in the chat box, and we'll try to get to you. We have built-in time after each of the presenters for a little Q&A kind of after each presentation. There's sort of two sections after I'm done with my spiel here. There'll be Lisa Durianchik's going to talk about the CEAP project from NRCS. We'll have a little time hopefully for questions after that. Then we're going to move to the introduction and overview of the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, and then we'll have some time for an open discussion after that. And I just want to highlight for folks that these are related. Conceptually, the topics are related. So I think Lisa is going to be focused kind of more on the monitoring part. It might be a little more technical in some respects about watershed scale monitoring and some of the great work that NRCS has been doing in this domain. And then the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework is sort of the, I think kind of it's a way to operationalize some of what's been learned about watershed scale monitoring from the CEAP project, kind of in the context of soil and water conservation districts and ways to use that information for monitoring, for planning, for prioritization. Jan, am I forgetting anything?
Nope, that all sounds good. Just during our question and answer periods, feel free to either type it in the chat and we can help read those out, or raise your hand and we can call on you. And as Levi mentioned, we'll have a couple of opportunities after each presentation and then the big kind of open discussion at the end. So I think that's everything.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'm just going to try to set the stage a little bit. I think we have folks attending this from maybe different programs or, coming at it from different angles. But the good news is I think there's a lot in here in terms of these approaches from the CEAP and the ACPF that might be applicable to all kinds of different programs and lenses. So one of the main goals is just to sort of introduce to folks who may not be aware that these programs and these projects exist. Because like I said, I think it might have some applications to the work that you're doing. Also, to learn from colleagues, right, who are kind of working on our domain, and then sort of explore ways that we can link the monitoring and the mapping and the planning and the outreach. I know I work a lot within the voluntary stewardship program, which I think many of you know about. I'll talk a little bit about it moving forward, but that program in particular requires monitoring at watershed scales, and it benefits from approaches where we can link the monitoring and link the planning and the prioritization to outreach and engagement to more effectively adaptively manage natural resources and agricultural viability in our watersheds. So this, the Washington State Conservation Commission has quite a few different programs. Sorry, one second, I'm getting a ping here. So we have a bunch of different kinds of programs, and these programs cover some different kind of natural resource themes, right? And in real life, a lot of these themes are related. So agriculture or irrigation deficiencies that result in increased water quantity will potentially have an effect on salmon, for example, depending on when that water is available. And are we talking about surface water, et cetera? So I think there's a need oftentimes to find frameworks that can be useful for sort of combining those two or combining multiple themes. Also, the Washington State Conservation Commission administers the Voluntary Stewardship Program, which encompasses about 3/4 or so of the area of Washington State. And within the Voluntary Stewardship Program, like I mentioned before, there is a need, explicit need, for monitoring at watershed scales along these themes. So monitoring who's participating in terms of producers, what kind of engagement exists between who's farming the landscape and who's doing some of this kind of planning and prioritizing so that we can protect our natural resources but maintain ag viability through the watersheds. In addition to that, there's a strong emphasis on monitoring for effectiveness. So that is like, how effective are the agricultural conservation practices that we're implementing on the ground? How effective are those at protecting or enhancing the functions and values of natural resources in those watersheds? And then also implementation. So where in the landscape are practices going in, and what kinds of practices are going in? And are those practices matching up with the natural resource concerns that are the biggest priorities for those communities? I'm going to kind of just breeze through these slides because you'll see more of this from our presenters. But the idea here is that when we're looking at the watershed scale as the focus, it brings up some special considerations. And I think for folks who I've worked with within sort of the voluntary stewardship program, for example, that work at conservation districts, thinking about things in terms of watershed scale and how to monitor at a watershed scale it's not necessarily something that folks have a ton of experience doing. And so that's sort of the purpose of today's session, is to bring in some colleagues who have been focused on doing a lot of work at this scale, because it also fits even folks who aren't yet in the voluntary stewardship program. I think a lot of times there's an interest and a need to sort of to kind of roll up what's been going on at a watershed scale, and it's a useful scale for planning and monitoring and outreach and engagement. So again, within the voluntary stewardship program, we have these 5 critical area types that we're focused on protecting or enhancing. They each have functions and values associated with them. Again, the idea here is there's often a lot of overlap between these. And I know some of the stakeholders I work with at times feel a little overwhelmed trying to get a handle on all these different aspects and how they might fit together. And here's just sort of a conceptual diagram within the voluntary stewardship program. We're sort of looking at over time relative to this baseline in 2011, what's been going on with essentially natural resources. Are they going up? Are they staying the same in terms of their quality? Or are they going down? And ideally, we want to, at minimum, keep them as they were in 2011, and if possible, increase the functions of those critical area types over time. But that requires planning and engagement and targeting activities in certain locations for specific needs. And so some of those examples would be looking at changes in habitat quantity over time. So here in Washington, that could be riparian areas, it could be shrub steppe, it could be wetlands. But we also want to know more than just how much habitat have we gained or lost, but what is the quality of that habitat over time as well. And in addition to that, in Washington, we have a lot of different types of agriculture, and the context of that agriculture and the context of what's going on in the watershed plays a really big role. And as well as the context of the natural resource concerns that we might have. And the idea is that there is no sort of one way to do it, because there's so many different contexts, really. And in a sense, because of that difference in context, we sort of need almost like custom tailored approaches for each of the watersheds or each of the counties. And an example of that is if you're an orchard dominated system, you might have, maybe one of your bigger concerns is insecticides or fungicides, versus if you're in a wheat dominated system, maybe it's more erosion control or encroachment from farms encroaching into wetlands or something along those lines. So the idea that we have different drivers of natural resource degradation in different watersheds for different reasons. And how do we how do we effectively summarize those and all that complexity, summarize that complexity in a way that doesn't diminish it, so it's still realistic to the complexity that's true, but is digestible in such a way that folks can use it for adaptively managing their projects and programs. The other thing I want to mention is we are fortunate in Washington because we have a lot of really good data actually relative to other parts of the country. It's not perfect, but for example, we have LiDAR coverage for quite a bit of the state, and I believe moving forward, we're going to have LiDAR coverage for the entire state. And that's really kind of like high resolution elevation data that's useful for a whole bunch of purposes. And then with the advent of cloud computing and sort of better satellite imagery, we can do some more with remote sensing. And then of course we have our own in-house monitoring that goes on with our sister agencies like the Department of Ecology and their water quality monitoring projects across the state. So in addition to that, we also, districts work with a lot of, and the commission itself, we work with a lot of partners and stakeholders. And so I think frameworks that allow us to better utilize the data and activities from our partner agencies will strengthen our ability to effectively manage natural resources moving forward. And this is my last slide before I hand it off to Lisa, but I just wanted to mention, I don't have too much to say on this yet because this has just happened, but the commission did get our agricultural science hub funded. And one of the goals of that is to sort of increase our connections and collaborations with our partner agencies at different scales, make sure that we are identifying and distilling the relevant information and then sort of amplifying it and sharing it out with our community, the relevant approaches for our colleagues at districts and even at county planning departments or our other state sister agencies as well. So more or less, I'm hoping that this morning's conversation highlighting NRCS's watershed monitoring stuff that Lisa will talk about here in a minute, and then the agricultural conservation planning framework group sort of fits into this this nexus of ag activities and ecosystem functions and processes, and then some of these cool tools to help us identify new ways of monitoring, planning, and prioritization at watershed scales. And with that, I think we're at handoff to Lisa.
Okay, sorry. Just getting oriented here on Zoom. And let me share some slides, and Levi, you can let me know if you can see these.
I can see that, Lisa.
Okay, it's working on the slideshow format, but there we go.
Perfect. Yeah, that looks like the good view.
Good?
Yep.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So first off, I want to thank Levi for connecting with me through a colleague, I think, initially, and for the invitation to share with you all a little bit today about what we've been working on to assess the effects of conservation practices. So this is that effectiveness assessment piece of monitoring that Levi alluded to in his presentation. And I think I'm going to go ahead and stop my video here in a second, just so we can focus on the slides. But I did want to introduce myself. My name is Lisa Duranchak. As Levi said, I do work with the NRCS. I work out of headquarters, and I'm in the resource assessment branch. So it's the part of NRCS that works on soil science and resource assessment. And one of the efforts that we have is a project called the Conservation Effects Assessment Project that I'll talk with you a little bit about today. But particularly, I focus my work on the watershed assessment studies part of that. So let me stop my video. And, I look forward to questions that you guys have at the end as well. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so I wanted to start off with a little bit of background on this project. It is a national effort. It's something we've been working on for quite a while now within USDA. And we started the CEAP project really in 2003, so 20 years this year. And that was really focused on in response to increased funding that came through the 2002 Farm Bill to USDA. And so along with that purse with extra funding came some purse strings and calls for better accountability in terms of what impacts we were having on environmental concerns and natural resource concerns relative to the conservation funding that was going to be appropriated to USDA. So we established an unprecedented effort in 2002 to really utilize a lot of the existing databases and infrastructure that USDA has, partner with many others, with the sole focus of quantifying the effects of conservation practices and sometimes programs, and really trying to build that science base for better managing environmental quality and the agricultural landscape in particular. And, you know, the first goal of CEAP at quantifying the effects of practices really was driven by the direction we got through the Farm Bill Managers Report that year. But the second piece of that, understanding the science base, that's for us internally in USDA, in our NRCS, you know, selfishly, how can we use this information to help us do a better job for as stewards of federal funds, you know, for citizens. So one of the first things we did was begin to build an assessment project that could address this large goal that we were given. And as Levi just showed in his last slide, there's sort of different scales of work that can go on. You know, being a federal agency, we do have a component of this CEAP project that is focused on national and regional assessments. These are large scale assessment studies. Most of them are using existing databases and using models to do some of that larger scale analysis. And you may be familiar with our cropland component, which released findings a year ago from our second national assessment of cultivated cropland. Levi mentioned a couple tools that have been produced through our grazing lands and our wildlife component, specifically the WRAP tool that he mentioned. So those have been supported by CEAP as well. And today I'm going to talk a little bit more about those watershed assessment studies I mentioned. They're smaller in scale, and we do collaborate with a lot of other agencies to carry those out. So our goals for the watershed assessment studies are to quantify measurable effects of conservation practices at the watershed scale and scales within that. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we do that in a minute. We're also wanting to enhance that understanding of conservation practice effects within the setting of a watershed. Obviously, conservation practices relate to one another. So how do they relate to one another? And how can we understand that to manage it and improve our planning? And that ties into our final goal there, which is informing local watershed conservation strategies and regional conservation strategies as well. I wanted to share with you a map of our projects. We have 24 projects currently that span across the US. The ones with the dark bolded names there are our active projects. We have some inactive projects shown on our map as well. And as you can see, we did have several that were in Washington State in the past. Those projects have all ended, but you know, they did produce some work on croplands or also on rangelands. So from these 24 projects, you know, we really manage this as a network. It's how I lead the national program. And so we have a lot of collaboration across these projects, and I'll kind of share some examples of how we do that later. Well, I mentioned partnerships, and certainly we couldn't undertake an effort like this on our own. And so in the CEAP watersheds projects, these projects are really very based locally in partnerships. We're drawing on other federal agencies, but also state agencies, conservation groups, you know, watershed councils locally tend to be involved in these, conservation districts, of course. So we're working, you know, collaboratively with a lot of groups to, you know, help support these projects. And we've recently started some in the Lake Champlain Basin in Vermont. And this is just a quote from one of the producers that we're working with, who helps to lead the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition. So they were very excited about CEAP coming to Lake Champlain Basin because they really wanted to understand what was working, what wasn't working, and how to do better. And that kind of ties into that whole adaptive management concept that Levi mentioned. So most of the reports and products that we produced over the years out of this part of CEAP are either books or peer-reviewed literature. And there's lots of that available online. You can find links to all of this on our website, and I'll share that website link with you at the end of my presentation. But I did want to just highlight a couple that I'll be talking a little bit about today. We did have one looking at an index tool that I'm going to mention in 2020. Also in 2020, there was a special issue on the Ag Conservation Planning Framework tool that you'll be hearing a little bit about today. And as well, we did have a special issue in May of 2020 that synthesized findings from 20 years of our work up until that point. So what did we communicate in that special issue in May of 2020? Well, we found at that point in time, which is based on, I guess, probably 15 years of published results at that point in time, that over half of the long-term watersheds where we've measured water quality can attribute a benefit to at least one constituent of water quality improvement to conservation implemented in the watershed. So, you know, that's pretty good. These are projects where many of them were sort of retrospective, so kind of looking back in time. Only our newest ones were established intentionally with the idea of documenting conservation effects, you know, and a lot of them there was existing monitoring or existing implementation that we were assessing effects of. So we feel like this is great that we can point to, you know, measured improvements in water quality at different scales for at least one constituent from conservation implementation. So that's kind of our bottom line. And these are two publications that if you're interested in this topic, I'd refer to you for more information. The special issue in May, a paper by Daniel Moriassi et al., and then this book that was published in 2012 on just a subset of our watersheds, our watersheds that we carried out in conjunction with USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture through competitive grants. And this includes a couple of the projects in Washington State, where we also found, you know, about half that we could attribute an improvement in water quality to conservation implementation. And that book is freely available online for download as well. So one of the things that we like to try to do, and we've been putting more emphasis on recently, is communicating some of our findings. I apologize, I see there's an error with some of my copying here that I didn't catch before, but hopefully you can read that. One of the things we've worked on recently are some videos. And this YouTube video in particular is on some of our work in the Western Lake Erie Basin. This was produced by NRCS in partnership with ARS. You can capture that QR code there and watch the video later if you're interested, but it's a great example of how we work through our partnerships with either universities, agencies, as well as producers to try to understand what conservation is being implemented, innovate new conservation practices, and evaluate it for its effectiveness. So that's a great example of what we're about, and I invite you to watch that afterwards. We've also recently updated our website in NRCS, so we do have some new content available on our website, and that's that address there. Or you can check out this blog if you're interested in something shorter and sweeter that was done about water quality outcomes of conservation just last August from NRCS. So all of this effort is because different folks need data, and generally they need it for different reasons, right? So, you know, Levi mentioned kind of the scale concept. So we have uses for data at the farm level, at the local conservation planning level to help, you know, inform and support adaptive management, conservation planning. But we also have uses at the watershed level, tracking if we're meeting water quality goals or how we can utilize conservation to address maybe agricultural concerns within a watershed and how well we're doing with that part of our effort. At the federal level, we're also using this kind of data and information to help us develop and determine how to best deliver our conservation programs, and our landscape initiatives are really great examples of this. They're all delivered now on a watershed basis. They have priority watersheds within them. They're smaller scale watersheds, and we're focusing on treating systems of practices. All those things are attributable to the work under the CEAP watershed study since 2003. And of course, as I mentioned initially, you know, we have this accountability expectation as a federal agency. So we're also using data to help us support official reporting that we do as a federal agency. So there's sort of a spectrum maybe of data quality along this line, but definitely along data uses as well by different groups. So one of the things that I was asked to share with you is what have we learned from these studies so far? Well, I think bottom line is conservation practices work, right? We have made some gains, and I showed that, the measurable improvements that we've been able to document, but we still have some conservation concerns, obviously, that still exist. So we're still using these lessons learned to help us improve our planning. One of the things that we learned is it's really important to plan comprehensively. So, and I think your VSP program seems to be a great example where you're considering not only water quality, but you're also considering wildlife benefits, wetland resources, you know, all these things, and how do we manage across these different resources that we have to try to improve overall. And I think one of the things that we know is that if we focus our conservation efforts in critical source areas, we can improve the effectiveness of those practices implemented, those dollars spent. So, you know, focusing conservation and trying to deliver more precise conservation is something that the ACPF group is going to talk more about later. So some other things we've learned, and these are all from that blue book on the NIFA-CEAP watershed synthesis that I referred to earlier. If you would like to read more, is, you know, working in smaller watersheds is a little easier to track. It's a little more tractable. It's a little easier to show impact in the nearer term. It's still a long-term effort, but That's an important lesson that we've learned. We need to plan at the watershed scale. So not just field by field by field, because it might take us a long time to get there if we approach every single field individually. But if we can analyze across a watershed to determine where we could potentially have the greatest impact with conservation efforts, and then focus our limited planning resources, whether that's personnel or dollars, to support implementation in the areas where we can have the greatest bang for the buck, that can help us deliver more results in the near term. And so planning at a watershed scale is something that's important. I mentioned using systems of conservation practices. And by that, I'm referring to, using multiple practices sometimes that can work together to further reduce pollutants or risk for losses to the environment. Also, we know that sometimes there are trade-offs in some of the conservation practices that we can employ. And so again, trying to utilize different systems of practices to manage these trade-offs is really important. And one way that we need to consider trade-offs is by thinking about the hydrology as well. We tend to kind of gravitate towards thinking about soils. I think in my agency in particular, that's our foundation and fundamental to our conservation planning. But understanding how the water flows on the landscape, through the landscape, is really important to selecting the most effective conservation practices to either intercept or treat the water resource of concern. So with regards to precision conservation, an important piece of that is selecting the right practices. And then the other side is for the right places, right? So when we think about selecting the right practices, we want to, again, consider not only soil factors, but also those hydrology factors. And, what types of processes, hydrologic processes, are going on, and how can we use that information to determine which types of conservation practices might be more effective in a certain setting. And this is a paper that was produced by students of Dr. Jan Boll, who's now at the Washington State University. He was in Idaho when he did this work. But it's a nice literature review. You can access this online. So thinking back to, again, some of our early projects, I know Levi's interested in monitoring to help inform the work that you all are doing out there, and you have a great start at, I think. Some of the things that we learned through our monitoring of the NRCS projects, again, was that about half of those projects, or 6 out of 13, were able to detect improvements in water quality that they could attribute to conservation implementation. And this was because they all had a significant level of conservation implementation in those watersheds, and they had an appropriate monitoring design to help them detect those effects. Levi's talked about either long-term approaches or paired approaches to water quality monitoring in watersheds. And both of these were utilized in projects that did detect improvements. So those are 2 types of approaches that can be successful in documenting conservation outcomes on water resources. One of the other things that we learned is that most conservation implementation projects, and this is our finding, is that they should not all be conducting water quality monitoring. And that's because the level of monitoring needed to document water quality improvement is fairly rigorous, and it's expensive. It's also technically challenging. And generally, we felt, our synthesis team felt that, it would not be feasible to have that kind and level of monitoring in every water quality project, in every watershed. So we've taken this approach of kind of having sort of showcase watersheds, if you will. We don't call them that, but a watershed where we're trying to make sure we're tracking our implementation as well as relating that to water quality changes as a result of conservation implementation. And we're doing that in a subset of watersheds as an example. Broadly, I think what we feel is important is to document conservation implementation and where that's occurring in your watershed relative to an assessment of a watershed to help you track your progress. Are you implementing the right kinds of practices in places that would be effective towards producing a result based on a good watershed assessment? And you're going to hear more about one approach to generating that kind of watershed assessment later this morning. So if a project does want to conduct water quality monitoring, really utilizing the appropriate design is very important. And I mentioned this, and Levi's talked about some of these different examples. He had a slide that showed, a nested design where you're starting up in the watershed and maybe breaking apart the watershed into smaller areas to try to detect effect relative to the implementation that's occurring in that part of the watershed. We also recommend, when it's feasible, to try to use a paired watershed approach. In this case, you do need a watershed that's going to be sort of business as usual and maybe not load up with additional conservation practices that you can compare as a control to a treatment watershed where you would try to achieve extra implementation, more technical assistance, those kinds of things. So that would be a paired approach. Statistically, the paired approach will give you more power and may allow you to be able to detect an improvement in water quality earlier in time than it would with the nested design. But it does mean that you have to find two watersheds that are comparable, except for the level of conservation implementation, perhaps in the two. So that can be challenging. Oftentimes, I think what we've gone to in our recent projects is coupling these paired designs with nested designs. So we're still breaking up the watershed into smaller and smaller pieces, starting at the edge of field, working to a sub-watershed that gets more heavily implemented and heavily instrumented for monitoring. And we're combining that with oftentimes a control watershed to, again, incorporate that paired watershed approach in our design as well. So another area that you need to consider, I think, are all these decisions that get made about water quality monitoring that can really influence if you're able to produce the kind of data you need in the end to attribute or detect an effect on water quality. So setting those goals and objectives for your monitoring design right at the outset. What's the scale of that monitoring, the frequency and duration? Do you have a lag time in your watershed, and what do you know about it, and how is that going to influence your monitoring design? And what are some other response variables that you can consider tracking as well? Levi talked about kind of customizing monitoring by watershed based on what's important. So it may be pesticides as a major concern in some places. In others, it might be phosphorus or nitrate. And so sometimes we can't afford to track all of those constituents. When we can, I think that's great. We can, definitely learn a lot. And sometimes there are unexpected things that happen over time that we won't detect if we're not monitoring for those constituents, but it's hard to do. So definitely having a design that's focused on the priority constituents that you're concerned about, and then implementing practices that will treat those specific concerns, water quality concerns, is very important. Well, none of this is easy. And these are some photos from Wisconsin and our USGS partner in Wisconsin that we work with on other projects under our Great Lakes Restoration Initiative up there. And, it's challenging, whether it's snow or floods and, blowing out monitoring equipment. This is not easy work by any means. So, again, that kind of ties back to our recommendation that not every watershed project will likely have this kind and level of instrumentation and monitoring associated with it that we do in our CEAP project. So some things to consider if you're designing a project like this are size of the watershed. I mentioned already, we find smaller watersheds to be better, and then trying to break up that area. So most of our CEAP watersheds are at HUC 12 at their largest. Sometimes we have modeling that's done at a larger scale at a HUC 8, a hydrologic unit code 8 watershed. But generally, we're trying to dig down within a small watershed, break it up into catchments or sub-watersheds, and then look within fields even where we can detect the effect of conservation, most quickly at that edge of field scale. You want to think about how you can design your project to help you distinguish amongst different land uses that might occur within your watershed and other factors that might influence the water quality and water quantity. Now we're all having to think about climate change and how does that affect our water resources and how might that come into play in a water quality or watershed monitoring design, for example. And then lastly, we have to consider conservation treatment history, as well as opportunity for additional treatment in a watershed if we're going to monitor that watershed over time going forward. Let's see. I'll share with you a few examples of some of the work that we've done in our CEAP watershed studies, just to give you a sense of what we're learning from some of these projects. And because we're working nationally, these results kind of vary in terms of how the projects were carried out and as well as what we've learned from the projects in different systems. But generally, we have these smaller scale efforts. This is our one of our Oklahoma CEAP watersheds in the Fort Cobb Reservoir in the Little Washita. And, we have some smaller scale watersheds where we're working, but we also have plots and fields within these. A sub watershed might be something like 41 acres, and a watershed as a whole may be something like 40,000 acres, so pretty large. And then you're using maybe some different types of approaches. I think you can see from this map, the monitoring really comes into play a lot at the smaller sub-watershed scales and field scales. At the watershed level, you may have, fewer data points to kind of go on at the outlet of the watershed. And so that's where you're definitely also using models to help you understand and attribute the impact of conservation to the water quality in a watershed overall. That's accumulating all kinds of effects from different land uses within it. So for edge of field examples, in Ohio, in the Western Lake Erie Basin, we have an edge of field water quality monitoring network. This is operated by USDA's Agricultural Research Service, ARS, and they have about 38 sites, maybe 36 now, where they have paired fields, a field that has received treatment and a field that has not, and they're monitoring these fields to try to determine the effect of a various conservation practice within that field. So having this edge of field footprint, if you will, as a network has really provided a lot of useful data, because this group can utilize data from across these sites then in analyzing information about the effects of conservation practices, and not just maybe a single study in a particular field that's run by one group, and then maybe someone else, has a different study somewhere else, but they're not collaborating. So, we've been able to gain a lot of insight that's helped informed conservation strategies, very much so in the Western Lake Erie Basin. For example, some of the things that we've been able to kind of tease apart or dig into are the 4 R's of nutrient management. And by that, we can look at things like placement, for example, or method. Is fertilizer being broadcast onto the surface? Is it being subsurface applied or tilled in to achieve some soil contact? And how much can we reduce dissolved phosphorus in this example by utilizing different methods of placement within the 4 R's even? And this has led to a whole effort by the state of Ohio supporting subsurface placement, even with sharing of equipment across farms to provide resources for producers to apply their nutrients in the subsurface, for example. We're also able to look at a practice like drainage water management, and and this is where you're sort of stopping water at the edge of the field where there's a tile system, and you're raising a board to release the flow of water at certain times of the year, depending upon the conditions that exist. And so we can look, for example, at implications of that conservation practice on discharge in this blue bar gets reduced significantly with the drainage water management system. And along with that are reductions in nitrate, but also there appear to be some reductions for dissolved phosphorus with the drainage water management system, which is interesting. And in the Western Lake Erie Basin, dissolved phosphorus is the primary water quality constituent that they're trying to address because of harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. Now looking at some examples in Mississippi, we can see, for example, that when we look at suspended sediment loads at the edge of a field after implementation of either a buffer, an edge of field buffer, or the Conservation Reserve Program, we can see significant reductions in total suspended sediment load from implementing conservation. Also, we can look at the nutrients and how these practices are influencing the nutrients. And are there reductions from the crop buffer compared to an actual crop field in nitrogen, the lighter green, or in total phosphorus, the darker green? So through edge of field monitoring, again, we can kind of see some of these effects in the nearer term. Then looking at a sub-watershed, and again, this is getting at that nested design that Levi talked about. Same watershed in Beasley Lake. This is an oxbow lake, and we're looking at, part of the watershed here where we have some vegetated drainage ditches as well as a sediment retention pond that was implemented. And what we can see here, again, are reductions in suspended sediment losses in the subwatershed from implementing the vegetated ditch or the sediment retention pond, as well as reductions in nutrients. However, then we can also look at the lake in this particular project. And the bottom figure here shows suspended solids in the Beasley Lake water quality itself over time. And this is 1996 through 2009. And these are various conservation practices that were implemented over time, either the vegetated buffer system, conservation tillage, conservation reserve program, and even a quail buffer implemented for wildlife concerns. And it further helps to reduce suspended sediments in Beasley Lake water quality. So they've been able to measure improvements in total suspended sediment in this lake water quality as a result of implementing conservation systems over time. There's also seasonal aspect to this. They found that in spring, the water clarity has improved significantly, and that persisted across various seasons of the year as well as across years. So when we move up to a watershed scale, then we're kind of getting at, a little bit of a larger area, and maybe the nature of things that we measure changes a little bit, and how we measure them also can change. In this case, this is in the Upper Snake Rock Creek in Idaho, part of the Snake River watershed and basin, and their concerns primarily are sediment and phosphorus due to surface runoff from furrow irrigated agriculture. And one of the things that we wanted to look at there was the impact of the conversion from that furrow irrigation method to sprinkler irrigation method, as well as construction of water quality ponds throughout the watershed. And then there's also in-field implementation of PAM in this case to reduce soil erosion risk as well. So in the Upper Snake Rock at a watershed basis, we have data dating back to 1971, obviously predates the CEAP effort that we're comparing to, where we are able to look at changes in sediment load as well as total phosphorus load in 1971 to data that's collected during CEAP, and how we've been able to influence the outflows in these gold bars. So, initially, we actually had a case where there was more sediment leaving the watershed than there was coming into the watershed in the inflow. And again, because this is an irrigated watershed and highly managed, we're able to kind of approach that monitoring design a little differently than we would in an eastern watershed, perhaps. So what we found here, is consistent and persistent reduction in total suspended sediment loss relative to the historical amount that led to, very much concern in this watershed. And the same thing for total phosphorus loss over time, to the point where we actually have less suspended sediment leaving the watershed at the outflow than what even comes in on a seasonal basis. So that's a real impact of conservation and a different way of looking at it in this kind of Western watershed where water is highly managed. Moving back east, one of the ways that we help to understand the impacts of conservation is by using models. So the water quality data that we collect is not used not only for measured impacts, but also it's used to help calibrate and validate models that we apply at the watershed scale or sub-watersheds, again, to help us understand the impact of conservation specifically within a watershed. Because there are so many things that influence water quality monitoring data, the models are another tool or approach that we can use to help us attribute and understand impact of conservation. And in this watershed, we looked at remote sensing of cover crop adoption in particular. And these figures show cover crop implementation, green being high, red being low, in 2008 and 2009 on the left, and then through time in 2015 and 2016, we're seeing an over 25% in increase in conservation cover cropping in this watershed. And through the models, we can document 25% 10-year reduction in nitrate leaching in the watershed as well, that we can attribute to the use of cover crops in these fields. So again, another tool to kind of help us understand the effectiveness of various conservation practices. In Iowa, again, we used remote techniques, but this time we used aerial photography and GIS analysis to help understand and quantify the amount and placement of conservation practices within a watershed. And there was a range of practices that were investigated as part of this particular study, mostly sediment and erosion control practices. And then they used in this CEAP watershed the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework tool, which you'll learn more about shortly, to help look at the implementation of those practices across the watershed. So what we were able to do in this project is going back to 1937, looking at implementation of those erosion control practices and able to determine that those practices were maintained on the landscape for 2 to 3 decades on average, depending upon the type of practice. And then we looked at where those practices were implemented within the watershed. What were the existing practices that are there, where using that Ag Conservation Planning Framework tool, where did the ACPF suggest citing a practice? That's in yellow here. And where did the existing practice and the ACPF match up? That's in the green. So about half of the watershed had conservation implemented for erosion control that aligned with that watershed assessment that was done with the Ag Conservation Planning Framework tool. So again, conducting a watershed assessment, knowing where you can achieve effective conservation through an assessment approach, and then tracking your implementation of practices over time can really tell you a lot about how well you're doing with your conservation efforts as well. And it's an important approach. We do have some special projects, and I'm just going to mention briefly, and then I think I'll wrap up to save time for some questions, because I see a couple things maybe in the chat there. I did want to mention that because we have this national network of projects, we have undertaken a number of special projects that allow us to look at maybe specific questions, sometimes in multiple places. So for some of our special projects, and we have had a whole range of these over the years, we're looking at certain questions deliberately and intentionally in different watersheds under different conditions and resource concerns to try to understand broadly, various conservation concerns. One of those that we've started to work on recently is legacy sources of nutrients. Legacy sources really do matter to watershed outcomes. And so USDA is trying to begin addressing this by documenting its significance and understanding where the concerns exist, and as well as understanding what types of practices might be most effective at addressing these legacy sources. They're important because they can be chronic sources of pollution to our water for decades, especially if they're involving groundwater or subsurface flows. If they're not treated, they can mask our present day effects of conservation. So if we're only paying attention, if you will, to conservation we implement now and impacts on the measurable water quality through surface water quality, we might be missing the importance of these legacy sources and how they impact our conservation effectiveness. As well, the strategies we might need to take to treat legacy sources, we're finding, are a little different than what we would use to treat more recently applied sources of nutrients, for example. So we really need to better understand this so that we can devise more effective conservation efforts. And that's what we're working on. So I mentioned lag time. Understanding lag time is really important because we can get into a situation where, we need to manage the expectations of the stakeholders and the stewards as well in a watershed. And there's a risk for misinterpreting the impact of conservation efforts if we rely, solely or singly on one type of assessment. So having a kind of broad understanding of the resource concerns and the significance or importance of those is important from the perspective of communicating with stakeholders the impacts of our conservation efforts as well, and continuing to support incentive for adopting conservation actions and making conservation behaviors, I think. So we have a whole portfolio of these projects that we've just started last year. We have 2 dealing with legacy phosphorus, one in the Western Lake Erie Basin that was started in 2020, so it's a little farther along, and a national assessment for legacy phosphorus that's coupled with that Western Lake Erie one as well. And then we've also started to look more at lag time. We have a project where we're trying to measure lag time through surface and subsurface waters. We're looking at legacy nitrate that is, tied to that lag time of project, and the legacy nitrate assessment is newer. We know this is really important in some regions, depending upon groundwater studies. And we also are looking at legacy sediment and utilizing sediment fingerprinting techniques, for example, in the Mississippi River Basin. But we're also going to be working towards trying to develop tools that will help us identify sources of legacy sediment within a watershed so that we can go out and address them with conservation efforts. I think I'm going to stop there, Levi. I talked a little bit about adaptive management and applying our findings to conservation, and I want to leave time to address a couple questions so that the ACPF folks can talk later too. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was fantastic. I think you covered a lot of ground, and I see just so many issues and themes that relate to a lot of the conversations I have with folks who are tasked with setting up monitoring and developing adaptive management protocols and practices and whatnot. So I'm curious, folks, if you have questions, don't be shy. You can raise your hand or use the chat box. I'm not sure, Jan, if there are questions in the chat box at this time.
I don't see any questions yet in the box.
Okay, while we're waiting, I guess, to see if any questions come up, I'll flip to one of my other slides just to mention, I guess, with the time then, that we do have a number of open databases. So our water quality database is called the Stewards database, but also we have databases that look at practice effects that we've kind of built, either field scale, nutrient loss databases, or practice effects databases that kind of cut across scales. So I'll be sure to get a copy of these slides to Levi for you guys. And then I just wanted to mention, skipping through a lot of things there, sorry, but our conservation outcomes webinars. This is a webinar series that we started in 2020 in NRCS to try to highlight what we're learning about practice effects. There is one of these on the RAP tool, I believe. Maybe you guys have seen it. If not, you can check that out. But these are the ones that were water quality focused, related to the work in the watershed assessment studies. And you can access recordings of the webinars as well as copies of the slides and citations. The ones we've done most recently include one on the Ag Conservation Planning Framework tool. Also, we did one, looking at resiliency and managing conservation in a changing climate. And, NRCS has really focused a lot on nutrient management in recent months, following the release of our cropland conservation report, our CEAP report last year. And one of the things that we did to share some of the science from the watershed studies that comes out from this monitoring about nutrient management was we did a webinar on that. So if you're interested in the details and the science behind the effectiveness of nutrient management, I invite you to, listen to that webinar and check out some of the citations where we broke down the 4 R's of nutrient management, as well as the importance of assessment and that site-specific nature to nutrient management.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lisa. And I just want to say I've seen probably 3 or 4 of those recorded webinars, and they're really great, full of a lot of really relevant and detailed information, and often are accompanied by more resources, more as like these links and stuff. That I think there's quite a bit of material that is highly relevant to lots of folks. So thank you.
Sure. And thanks to Jan for putting that link in the chat for me.
And I'll remind folks too, we're going to have some time for open discussion after the ACPF presentation here shortly. I'll just kind of hold off for another minute or a little bit here, see if there's any questions that pop up. All right, not seeing any. Emily, do you want to go ahead? And Emily Zimmerman is going to be presenting on the behalf of the ACPF folks, and I'll let you maybe do a brief introduction about yourself, Emily. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Levi. Y'all can see my screen okay? It's like the perennial Zoom question. Thanks, Robin. Yeah, so thanks, Levi and Jan, for inviting us here this afternoon where I am, this morning where many of you are, to talk a little bit about the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework, or the ACPF. So my name's Emily. I'm an assistant professor at Iowa State University in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management in the Department of Horticulture. And as part of my role at Iowa State, I'm also one of the co-leads for the ACPF National Hub. Rick Cruz, who's in the Department of Agronomy and at the Iowa Water Center, is the other co-lead. And then we have a much broader team as well, a tech team led by Robin McNeely, a training and communications team led by some folks at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I'm going to talk a little bit about ACPF today, but I'm really here on behalf of a broader group. I also want to mention that funding for the ACPF has come from USDA NRCS, and it also originated with USDA ARS. So we really owe a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today to both of those agencies who have supported us with both funding and people. So here's just a quick overview of some of the stuff I want to talk about today. So the ACPF, I'm going to talk about what it is and essentially how it works. I'm going to think a little bit about its role and use in conservation planning. I want to especially highlight the 9-step conservation planning process that NRCS uses, and then also talk a little bit about use of ACPF in the context of adaptive management. So really thinking about planning, prioritization, outreach, and then that final step with monitoring. I'll share a little bit about who can use the tool and the support that's available. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about some potential opportunities for the tool's use in Washington. And I hope that sort of spurs some discussion and conversation about potential uses for ACPF as a planning tool or in the context of CEAP. I know Lisa talked a little bit about the combined use of ACPF in some watersheds in Iowa, and there are some really nice potential opportunities there. All right, so let's get down to it. So the ACPF, so what is it? The ACPF is a science-based, data-driven approach to agricultural conservation planning, both at field and small watershed scales. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in the conservation planning world is that small watershed scale is really important. Lisa emphasized that in her talk, and we feel like that's really one of the strengths of this tool. So the tool allows you to identify opportunities to install best management practices to meet soil and water quality needs at scales where you can actually see individual fields, and then also out of that broader watershed scale to allow us to understand where coordinated planning processes might occur. One of the strengths of the tool itself is that it recognizes that farms and really watersheds are unique and heterogeneous. So that means that the geography, the biophysical features, the geopolitical features, so the fields in each watershed might be different. And so using geospatial data, we can really identify those localized areas where we might have potential resource concern. Again, thinking mostly about soil and water. And then to address those areas of resource concern, what are the best management practices that might be most opportune, either infield, edge of field, or downstream? And again, recognizing that farms, watersheds, landowners are all heterogeneous and might have different goals, the ACPF is really going to provide essentially menus of best management practices that landowners or stakeholders might consider. So it's a non-prescriptive process that's really designed to engage stakeholders with envisioning what kind of conservation might be most appropriate in their specific case or situation. Okay, so how does it work? So the ACPF has 3 primary components. So I'm going to talk about each of these sequentially. So the first is that the ACPF is really based on principles of agricultural watershed management. And you can see a very simplified conceptual framework on the right-hand side of the slide. So this figure comes from a paper that Mark Tomer wrote in 2013, right as sort of the first iteration or the beta version of this tool was released. So you can see that in the bottom of that pyramid, right? When we think about managing our agricultural watersheds and our agricultural fields, the first thing that we really want to think about is how to build soil health. Lisa emphasized that, right? NRCS is very much involved in emphasizing soil health. It's similar here. But we know that just building soil health isn't going to help us address all of our soil, nutrient, or water quality concerns, right? We understand that we might need to move up that pyramid to control water within fields using best management practices like controlled drainage or grassed waterways, to control water below fields using impoundments like wetlands, for example, and then finally thinking about those critical riparian areas that we might need to engage with conservation practices. So this is sort of the simplified pyramid approach to the ACPF tool. This is a little bit maybe of a daunting diagram, but I'm going to step through it. This is the more in-depth framework that the tool uses. So I want to orient you to this figure just like I did with the pyramid. So at the top, we're sort of flipping the pyramid upside down now. At the top, in that sort of orangish colored rectangle, you can see that soil health emphasis, right? So avoiding and controlling soil, nutrient, and water quality issues before they leave the field, right? Before they become issues. But then again, like I mentioned in that pyramid, we understand that that probably isn't going to address all of our soil, nutrient, and water quality goals in all parts of our landscape. So if you move down those rows, what you see is where those conservation practices might be located in order to address those soil and nutrient concerns. So that gold color, that row is in-field practices, the green color below field practices, and that blue color in that riparian zone. And then in the case of ACPF, we often think about the nutrients that we might be the most concerned about as either nitrate, which is going to move with our tile drainage here in the Midwest, so our subsurface drainage. And then in the column on the far right-hand side of the slide, surface runoff and phosphorus. So essentially what you have here is a matrix that shows where we would see the opportunity to install that best management practice, and then the nutrient that we're attempting to treat and the mechanism by which it's moving. So if we look, for example, at below field, and we're thinking about tile drainage and nitrate, we might be thinking about bioreactors or nutrient removal wetlands. If we're thinking about phosphorus in that same location, potential practices might include perennial cover or water and sediment control basins. So essentially the tool is really designed to help folks think about which practices go in which place to treat which potential nutrient concern on the landscape. Okay, so how do we actually do that, right? How do we operationalize that framework? So the first thing I want to mention is that the ACPF works using publicly available geospatial data. So you can see in the map on the upper right-hand side of the slide, the areas that are blue, those are HUC 12 watersheds, and the blue areas represent where data are currently available for using the ACPF. So there are about 12,200 HUC 12 watersheds that are shown on that map in that blue color, and they stretch across about 11 different states. So these are the areas where a potential user could go to our website, acpfforwatersheds.org, and download a curated geospatial database, essentially that has these these 4 base layers present in that database that's ready for them to use. So to run the ACPF, a user would need 6-year land use and crop history data, soils data from GSurgo, a digital elevation map, field boundaries, and a HUC 12 watershed boundary. For these 12,200 watersheds shown in blue, ACPF, you can go on the website and download all of the data except for the digital elevation map, or digital elevation model, which most states would have publicly available for users anyways. I'm going to step through some of these base layers of data just so folks have a little bit more of an understanding about where those data are derived from. I think it's important to mention this because what you don't see on that map in the upper right is Washington State, right? So if this is a tool that's ultimately of interest and has some applicability, we'd want to talk about the data that are available and the ways that folks could create a structure to make these data useful for ACPF. So I'm going to talk a little bit about on this slide, the land use information and field boundaries. So the land use information is derived from the Cropscape cropland data layer. That's published on an annual basis from the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service. Those data are from satellite, and then there's also some survey verification that also occurs. And so essentially, those data are collected in 30 by 30 meter pixels. So they're small squares across the landscape. And so what ACPF essentially does is it takes those data and then it looks at each individual field. So you can see an example of a watershed in central Iowa here. These small gray outlines around these polygons, those are individual fields. So for each of those individual fields, the ACPF is going to summarize the majority land use in that field, and it's going to store it in an attribute table. And then you can also see, if you look in this table, this is from ACPF, there's a general land use category. That land use category is going to include, is going to consider 6 previous years of data. So what that allows us to understand is what the crop rotation is like in any given field throughout the database. So that would tell you essentially what's been grown there and what a producer's rotation might be like. For soils, like I mentioned, the soils data in ACPF are derived from the GSurgo soils database. So there are, I think, over 70 tables in the GSurgo soils data. ACPF has custom tables, so we extract just key attributes of the soils information, things particularly, for example, about horizons and texture that would influence nutrients, soil, and conservation practices. And then those are provided as custom tables in the ACPF. And then finally, I mentioned that digital elevation model. The DEM is, I would argue, one of the most important pieces of the ACPF. You can see again for this same case study watershed, the digital elevation model on the far left-hand side of the slide. And then the derived slope at the field level, and then also hillshade. So terrain analysis is an important first step in ACPF. And so this digital elevation model is really important. All right, so last step. So we talked a little bit about sort of the theoretical framework of ACPF. We talked about the data that are required to run ACPF. And the last thing I want to highlight is the tool itself. So the tool operationalizes the conservation planning process using a GIS-based tool to identify opportunities to install best management practices that address those soil and water quality needs. So on this slide, in this sort of that center area, you can see some of the conservation practices that are currently included in the ACPF. So Levi mentioned that in Washington, different watersheds have different resource needs. The tool ACPF was created mostly in the Midwest, where phosphorus and nitrate are our primary concerns. So really thinking about how to slow water and sediment down, and then also how to retain water to allow denitrification to occur. So the practices, some of the practice examples that you see in the center of the slide really reflect concerns around those resource needs. So things like grassed waterways, water and sediment control basins, nutrient removal wetlands, bioreactors, contour buffer strips, both riparian and saturated buffers. There's also two-stage ditches, drainage water management, farm ponds, some other practices that are also included in the ACPF that I don't have pictured here. And then on the far side of the screen, on the right-hand side, you can see just a simplified schematic, essentially, of the various steps that the ACPF user would go through to actually run the tool. So the first is digital elevation model preparation. That's going to involve terrain analysis. So just essentially making sure that water flows down and water flows where you think it is. This step is really, really critical for the understanding the hydrology of these watersheds and where practices might have the best opportunity to be placed. That's followed by stream and catchment delineation, so understanding where the perennial stream network is and delineating small watersheds around that. Field characterization, which provides important information about where we might suspect tile drainage to be placed in Iowa or in the Midwest, which is important to think about nitrate for. And then also fields that might have a high runoff risk, so thinking about concerns related to phosphorus. And then the next three steps, precision conservation practices, impoundment conservation practices, and riparian assessment, those are going to be steps that actually identify those opportunity areas for best management practice placement. So really identifying all of the opportunities in a given watershed to place those practices. A couple of final tools I want to point out. So the Soil Vulnerability Index, or SVI, is a new toolbox that was just added to the ACPF with this last update. And so there are some new opportunities with the SVI in ACPF. And then that final box, which we call utilities, that could be a potentially important toolbox for Washington State. That toolbox offers tools that can help take data. So for example, some of the input data that I just talked about, and take those data and put them into a structure that ACPF, a naming context that ACPF can use. So Washington, I'm going to spoiler alert to a later slide, but has really strong data available. So Levi highlighted that, and I'll highlight it again. And so taking those data and putting them into the format that would be usable for ACPF is a final tool in the toolbox. All right, so you run the tool. What do you actually get out of it, and sort of how could it be used, right? Why is it useful? So I want to first just reference the map and the image on the right-hand side of the slide, because I'd imagine that's where folks are probably looking anyway. So this is a map of a small Huck 12 watershed in central Iowa. So this watershed is very, very flat. It's a low relief landscape. It's dominated by row crop corn and soybean production. About 95% of the acres in this particular watershed are in row crop corn and beans. And you can see there is a perennial stream network that runs essentially through the middle of this watershed. And so we see concerns both about phosphorus and nitrate in this particular watershed. And so what you're seeing here is that we've identified some areas of potential resource concern. So you can see that for runoff risk and predominantly phosphorus, we've identified various fields based on slope and proximity to stream that we may want to think about for targeting for phosphorus in particular. And then as we move away from that perennial stream network and the landscape becomes very flat, we recognize with ACPF, thinking about soils and slope, that there are probably a lot of fields that are tile drained, that are that drainage is being diverted to this perennial stream network, and that there's probably some nitrate concerns. So based on that, in this example scenario, we have bioreactors and nutrient removal wetlands, which are going to treat nitrate, and we have contour buffer strips that are going to address phosphorus concerns. And so we've used ACPF to identify all of the potential opportunities for those practices in this particular watershed. You can see a cutout in the upper right-hand corner of the slide here, where we have bioreactors in that green box, contour buffer strips in this orange line, and then nutrient removal wetlands in these purple polygons. So based on that map, when we think about ACPF, I think there are two things I really want to highlight for use. So first, the NRCS 9-step conservation planning process. So this tool can really help identify potential areas of resource concern. So for example, those fields where we might see a high risk of runoff. There can also be opportunities, right? So where are the areas where we might place practices? With the input data, there's an opportunity to inventory and analyze current resources, so land uses, soils, hydrology. And then I think probably the most obvious use is formulating these alternatives, right? So what are the alternative options for conservation in these areas? And then what are the trade-offs with respect to those practices that might be of interest to either planners or to landowners and stakeholders themselves? And then the other piece I want to mention here is just the adaptive management framework here, right? So this tool can be used to help folks plan, right? So where are all of the opportunities for conservation practice placement in a potential watershed? What are the objectives that we're trying to meet? Where might these practices be most suitable? Which practices might we be most interested in? Should there be specific areas that are prioritized, right? So you can see in that map that some fields might have a higher runoff risk than others. So would those be fields that we'd really want to key in on first, right? Would we really want to try to address those needs first? These maps, I'll mention this in a later slide again, but this visualization of these data can be really powerful when doing outreach. So watershed groups, for example, might use these maps to really think about where the opportunities might be, who might need to be at the table, how to have some of these conversations about collaborative conservation. And then I think a step that, maybe not talked about as much with ACPF, but I think ties really nicely, especially to what some of Lisa mentioned, is the monitoring piece. So if you are trying to think about strategic monitoring, really thinking about practice placement ahead of time and where these practices might go to serve the needs of the monitoring process could be really useful. And on the other hand, using the monitoring to feed back into the ACPF to make it more effective would also be a real strength here. So before, I was just going to say, before I move on, I see Levi has his hand up.
Or one of the Levi's.
I think it's one of the Levi's. Sorry, someone's got their hand up. It's a non-Levi.
Levi has a question. Or maybe not. Does anyone have a question?
Maybe it was an accidental button push.
All right, we'll move on. Interrupt me. Please do interrupt me though if folks have questions. I'm happy to be interrupted. So feel free to either raise your hand and I'll try to see you, or turn on your mic.
Cool.
All right. So a couple things I want to emphasize here. So I think ACPF has a lot of opportunities to be used by a lot of different folks. So what I just talked about, right, was this framework, these geospatial data, and using an ArcGIS-based tool. So one of the things that's important to understand is that it is critical to have somebody who has GIS-based skills run the ACPF itself, right? So there does have to be a familiarity, at least at a basic level, with using ArcGIS to use the ACPF. Oftentimes, we'd also want that GIS user to have an understanding of watershed management, just so that as we're using the ACPF and running the ACPF, that the decisions that we're making also make good biophysical sense with on-the-ground conditions. So to run the tool itself, we need someone with GIS-based experience. But the outputs from the ACPF that I just showed you on the previous slide, where you can see information about where those practice opportunities might be, those data can be used by folks who might not have GIS-based skills, right? So those might be in field offices, conservation planning partners, the folks who are actually on the ground engaging with landowners and stakeholders. So sort of two groups of folks who might either run the ACPF or use the results data from the tool itself. The tool is being used across the Midwest and in other parts of the country as well. And it's being used by folks in state, county, local agencies, nonprofit organizations, and then also by some for-profit folks as well. So the tool is currently really broadly being used across the Midwest. And so the outputs, as I mentioned, can be really helpful when we think about engaging with landowners and farmers or with watershed organizations and other stakeholder groups. So again, being able to go out or meet with a watershed group and have a big map or project that watershed map and think about where are our resource concerns. Is what we're seeing on the screen, does that transfer over to what folks are experiencing in the field? Do those practice opportunities, are those what folks are interested in? What might be other opportunities? How would those fit within the current farming and management systems of the watershed? Having that map and having those data about all of those opportunities can really guide those conversations around practice placement and around resource concerns. And then the final thing I'll mention here just on this slide is that you've probably seen a running round of citations on the bottom of a number of my slides. But one thing I really want to highlight about the ACPF is that there's a really active group of researchers and scientists who are thinking really hard about not only the biophysical science of the tool, but also the social science. So seeing how the tool is being applied. There's a number of papers about the tool being used in watersheds, again, around the Midwest. And as Lisa pointed out, there's a special publication or a special issue of the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation from 2020 that highlights not only some of the social science, but also some of the biophysical science that folks are working on with the ACPF. All right, so what support's available, right? So tools, there's tons of tools, but I think really one of the critical parts for successful use of a tool is having a support system. And so the ACPF National Hub is funded by the USDA NRCS, and the hub is really here to help users of ACPF, right? Our goal is to really help folks meet their conservation planning goals using data-driven approaches and the ACPF. So we're here to help users. And so that includes making sure that there's an accessible ACPF geospatial database to support planning approaches, planning tools, and program delivery. That means developing, maintaining, storing, and updating vetted ACPF toolboxes. So we release new iterations of the toolbox as we add to it or discover ways to make it better. We also provide outreach and training resources for folks who are interested in using the ACPF, folks who might be GIS oriented, or folks who might be more interested in using the results, so conservation planners. And then really our final goal is to be a resource to cultivate networks of ACPF users. So what that's historically meant is us working with states. So over the past few years, we've held meetings with a number of different states who have different interests and uses of the ACPF. So we're really trying to help folks access the tool and to understand how we can help people make it most useful in their individual cases. I mentioned this at the start, but the ACPF National Hub is really a partnership between Iowa Water Center, Iowa State University, University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, University of Minnesota, and the North Central Region Water Network. I really briefly want to mention that there are also 2 additional agreements that are currently ongoing with ACPF. The ACPF Enhancement Project, the PI on that is John Baker at USDA ARS. That project is really about advancing the tools around ACPF, and then a project that looks at the economics of conservation practice placement, and that's led by myself and John Tyndall at Iowa State. So the last thing I kind of want to end with here is just, thinking about potential opportunities for ACPF use in Washington specifically. So I guess a couple of things that I think are really neat and exciting for Washington in particular. So I'm going to talk about the framework and the ArcGIS-based toolbox piece of ACPF first. So like I mentioned previously, ACPF was developed in the Midwest, and it's largely been applied in the Midwest, although there has been some work in the East. And so I think there are a lot of really interesting opportunities to think about what would this tool look like if it was to be adapted to Washington's landscape, right? So for example, the first 3 steps of the ACPF are terrain analysis, stream network and catchment delineation, and field characterization. And that final step of that field characterization is really getting at helping us to identify areas of potential resource concern. And right now in the ACPF, those areas of potential resource concern are really about areas that we might experience nitrate or phosphorus loss, right? But in Washington, those might not be the areas of resource concern, right? So for other areas of resource concern, we would have to think about how to integrate those, or if it was worthwhile to integrate those into the tool. So the resource concern piece might look different. And we need to really think clearly about what that is and whether or not the ACPF could be useful for that. I also mentioned a number of conservation practices that ACPF helps users identify opportunities for. Are those the same practices that would be of interest in Washington? And does their siting process look different in the landscape that Washington has, right? So again, thinking about tool applicability and then also tool placement. And I think that would have a lot of implications on the tools on ACPF's use in the planning and prioritization process. I think one of the really neat opportunities have talked a lot about monitoring data, right? So if there are monitoring data available, perhaps that monitoring data could help inform some of these questions that I've just highlighted here about making this applicable to Washington. With respect to geospatial data, Washington has a lot of the data required to use the ACPF. I think really the challenge or the opportunity there would be compiling those data into a structure that would be required by ACPF. We have had conversations about what that might look like a little bit. And again, there is that utilities toolbox in ACPF, and ACPF National Hub could offer some support to sort of think about that process. And then finally, again, we do offer training and outreach. So we can offer, training about the ACPF and certainly help facilitate some network creation if that was of interest or useful. Okay, so thanks, Levi, for popping that into the chat. Levi put the website in there, so that's, y'all can check that out. And so that's actually all I really have. So I just want to again mention that the ACPF National Hub is, you can find us on that website that Levi just put in the chat. You can email us at acpfsupport@iastate.edu and one of us will get back to you. You can also reach out to either myself or Rick Cruz. I have our contact information there, and I'll share these slides if that's all right. So again, we'd be happy to chat more about ACPF with anyone who might have interest. And with that, I think I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Thank you, Emily. That was really great. I super appreciate it. And thanks again to Lisa too for the previous discussion. I feel like the approaches are really complementary, and it was really nice to see the presentations kind of both this morning stacked together to sort of see where there's a lot of overlap. Okay. Yeah, and Jan's posted in the chat about there was a question about whether the presentations and slides will be posted, and they will be on the CTD website later this week. So we have some time for questions and open discussion. I think I was going to kind of ping. I looked at the attendance list, and I was going to see if like maybe Brad Johnson or Kathy or Pauline from San Juan has any input. I kind of have an idea of what a lot of the counties are doing, and folks, just even on the GIS end that you sort of capped it off with, Emily, about there would be a need to take this data that we have in Washington and link it, sort of absorb it in the ACPF framework in order to sort of use these tools. We have a range of GIS expertise in our stakeholder community out here. There's some folks who are pretty sophisticated already. So just kind of curious, and I know some folks kind of have some watershed planning frameworks already, but oftentimes those are borrowed from like a fisheries enhancement group or like a multi-species habitat management plan. Curious if there's any input from folks like that, or Grant. I know that you had done your an irrigation, some sort of irrigation efficiencies mapping. I'm just wondering if there are any obvious intersects with some of the work that you've already been doing. Looks like a non-Levi. Levi's got a hand raised. I'm not sure, Jan, about the muting. Okay, looks like you're unmuted.
This is Greg Haddish. I'm with NRCS in Iowa. I saw there were several NRCS people on this call, and I just want more of a comment is that one of the things we're doing with the results data is we're accessing services that the National Hub is putting out, their web services that we can bring right into Conservation Desktop. So our field office folks can look at those results during their planning process to look at where there could be some potential conservation practices placed. And then we can also utilize those same services within the ArcGIS environment. So if we have some higher end GIS people that want to bring it into ArcGIS Pro or ArcMap, they can use it there as well.
Great, thank you for that. That's all news to me, and that seems like a really great opportunity for sort of that. I know with the farm planning, you can get really good details from being on site and what's going on in that particular parcel, but probably having that broader view might be informative and helpful. So nice to know that there's a linkage there. Grant, looks like your hand's up.
Yeah, I'll just speak a little briefly. I think Emily or you, I can't remember, was saying that Washington does have some good public data, which is definitely true as far as like the USDA cropland use. And that was really exciting. They do have some things on kind of what rotation they have and irrigation. And so there's definitely some opportunities to look as sort of a before and after or tell a better story. And so it's very exciting. We sort of did like an irrigation before and after thing here in Walla Walla, and definitely available if anyone wants to ask about that. I think for myself, and I'm sure a lot of other people, it's been mentioned, but just trying to find the balance of how many, having something that's comprehensive enough and tells a good enough story as far as monitoring goes, but balancing that with some of the realities as far as how many resources and time and expertise that a lot of districts have. So really good to hear some of the tools and different things being used, and I'm sure that we're not the only ones in that position as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Grant. And yeah, I think on your irrigation, just stay tuned. I'm hoping to talk to you, see if maybe we can have you come talk at one of the future science symposiums on that particular project too. Kathy, I see your hands up.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I guess I have just a little bit of a more technical question, coming from where we're at, where we have really small farms and we have really high resolution data, like a DEM, for example, is 1 meter here. And I'm just curious if that would work with this tool, and it would be really nice to have that higher resolution focus. Because a lot of times when we work with 30-meter data, it's just not that helpful.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Kathy. And I also want to, so I'm going to respond. And Robin, if I'm wrong, you can correct me. Robin's the tech lead for our project. But a DEM between 1 and 3 meters would be ideal for running ACPF. So that 1 meter DEM should be fine. So I think that would work really well. Robin, do you have anything you want to add to that? No? Okay. Kathy, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. That would be great. I think this is a really neat tool that could be really useful. So it's good to hear that at that resolution, it would be helpful for us. So thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Kathy, something I guess I can add too is we did have a project that Emily mentioned looking at ACPF use in the eastern states. And one of our main questions there was how to apply ACPF on smaller fields and smaller farms than they might have in Iowa and in the parts of the Midwest where the tool was developed. So that project's wrapping up as we speak. It'll be wrapped up by fall. So we do have some, I think, insights coming out of that project in the future as well for how to best apply some of the tools within ACPF for smaller fields and smaller farms. Of course, they have some different hydrology there too in some of the eastern states and topography, but the field size piece, definitely does come into play for some of the tools that can get cited, or some of the practices, that can get cited with some of the tools that exist within ACPF. So we'll have a little more on that as well. And that was in a project we called ACPF in the Eastern States.
Thanks, Lisa. Looks like Philip has a question.
Yeah, so Phil Long, Lake Chelan Research Institute. So in Lake Chelan, we're very interested, of course, in the nutrient introductions from ag. We have a TMDL of 4.5 micrograms per liter for the lake. The notion is that it's definitely phosphorus limited. That's very important to us. It's also important, though, the whole question of legacy pesticides, especially DDT. So fish tissue in lake trout in Lake Chelan has the highest DDT concentration anywhere in the country, possibly anywhere in the world. And so we're interested in that flux. And we know that there's about 100 metric tons of DDT in the soils in the Manson area in Lake Chelan. So obviously there's some flux going on and it's not decreasing. The disconcerting part about the concentration of fish tissue is it's essentially unchanged for 25 years. And so that's not typical for this situation. And so just a question about whether ACPF has been used for contaminants in general and DDT in particular.
That's a great question, Phil, and that's also really interesting. I didn't know that. It has not been. Historically, the tool was developed and has been used mostly for nitrate and phosphorus. That's really been the tool's long-standing application. I will mention that we have been having conversations both with Lisa, and Lisa, I'll pause here when I'm done and let you hop into. We've just started to think about the potential applicability of ACPF for thinking about pesticides, both with some partners at the EPA and then also with folks at NRCS. So I think that those are very early and preliminary discussions. I think one of the things that we've started to recognize is that, at least for some of the best management practices, that we have in the toolbox in the Midwest, that there may be some applicability around pesticides as well, but we haven't really dug very deeply into that. Lisa, do you want to offer any additional comments about that?
I don't think so at this point, Emily. I think it's very early on, I guess, and the idea is just to explore, what could be done to address those kinds of resource concerns. And, hopefully in future years, we might have more on that, but we're really just going to be having some initial discussions coming up in the next few weeks. So thanks for sharing your concern and your situation out there in your lake, because I wasn't aware of that history either. So that's interesting, and that's helpful to know as we try to support you guys going forward. And on the phosphorus front, I guess I can say through our companion project, the ACPF enhancement project that Emily alluded to, we are working to try to add some additional conservation practice tools to ACPF that address dissolved phosphorus a little bit more. And, so again, I think in the future iteration, we'll have more on some of those practices, we hope. We do have practices for those, and we have some planning tools like engineering planning tools and things like that for some of those conservation practices. But the ability to kind of look across the watershed and determine, where some of those practices might be feasible for further focused investigation is what we're trying to do as part of our work broadly under the ACPF enhancement project.
Thank you for that. That's great. And just in case you think it's just DDT in Lake Chelan, we also have lead and arsenic from lead arsenate sprays, which are even, of course, an older pesticide. And so we always like to say that it's fortunate that the lead and arsenic aren't all that soluble. Otherwise, it would be a bigger problem for us. Especially the lead tends to stay in the soils, but it's there as a problem for us in other ways. Like every development now has to deal with it in some fashion if it's going to be residential, for example.
Thanks, Phil. It looks like we have another hand. Sorry, sir. It says you're Levi, but I'm guessing you're probably not.
This is Dave James, ACPF developer. I just wanted to point out, Phil, to your lake issue. In version 3 of the ACPF, we added lake boundaries to our riparian assessment tool. And this is a very unique tool. It takes either a single line stream, a wide river, or a lake boundary, and it uses that edge, and it segments it up into 250 meter long stream lake boundary shoreline segments. And then it uses that tool to build watersheds or riparian catchments. So what you're doing is essentially capturing the different contributing areas for each 250 meter shoreline segment. And what that does, it allows you then to investigate up the hill from that particular shoreline. This is a really, really exciting piece of the ACPF that I don't think gets enough earplay. But I think for someone in your position, being able to look uphill and find potential sources of DDT or legacy DDT and these other constituents that you're interested in would then allow you to kind of focus on where those things might be coming down into the lake.
That's great. I'd like to follow up on that. Well, of course, we don't have ACPF working yet in the Chelan Basin, but we're hopefully headed that way. So that's great.
Yeah, and on that note, if I could just, I was thinking as during the two different presentations, again, so my name's Levi, I'm at the Washington State Conservation Commission. I work primarily within the voluntary stewardship program. So that's sort of the lens I'm thinking of with this comment here. But I feel like we have heard through the voluntary stewardship program comments, say, for example, from the technical panel that we had a couple years back, when the counties were submitting their reports on what they're seeing in terms of monitoring, and they're kind of the first attempt to try to tie these pieces together and tell a story. And I think one of the comments for many of the counties was, or for many of the tech panel members about the county reports was, there's some work to do to tie the pieces together, to kind of connect the dots, right? Between the monitoring, between the implementation, between sort of the context of the watershed that you're reporting from. And there was a couple things like during Lisa's presentation about monitoring, putting the right practices in the right places. And in order to do that, you kind of need to know the context of the place, right? So the same practice in the same place won't have the same effect depending on the soils or the proximity to the river, for example. And having appropriate monitoring designs based on whatever specific natural resource concern you have in order to develop a successful kind of monitoring approach. And I really feel like the ACPF is, on the other side of that coin, a really great tool for stakeholders to use to figure out what are those contexts. And you saw that great map from Emily at that sub-watershed scale. I think that was looking at the nutrients, and you had highlighted, the hotter red colors, those parcels that seem to be more likely to be contributing large amounts of nutrients versus others, and relative to their proximity to the riparian zone, but also relative to the hydrology of that watershed. And so I feel like I just wanted to kind of hammer that home for folks. I really see these two approaches as very complementary, and also meeting the needs of a lot of the comments that folks receive from those 5-year reports. So I just wanted to like try to make that extra explicit. I really feel like this is a very helpful way to be thinking moving forward when you're thinking about managing your VSP. These are some specific tools to help you do the prioritization, to help you get the context, and then to help you sort of make sense of the monitoring. I'm thinking, just thinking about some stakeholders I've worked with who have, for example, access to data from groundwater wells. And one of the first questions is like, we have this, big Excel spreadsheet with all this data, and there's like 50 different wells. I'm not sure which wells I should be looking at. I'm not sure which constituents I should be looking at. Well, I think a tool like this, when you have a framework like this, it will help you if you have if you have the GPS coordinates of the wells and you know something about the hydrology, might give you a better idea about what constituents you might be able to mine from that data that already exists, and which of those like 100 wells you have access to is actually being influenced by ag versus not. So that's just one example of ways that I think these tools could help really cut through some of the complexity of the situation and help really kind of focus our efforts. Sean, it looks like your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off that, Levi. I think you summed that up really well. And I just wanted to add an extra point to that of the value of today's conversation for voluntary stewardship program. And I'll just introduce myself real quick. Sean Williams. I work at the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife as our agency's voluntary stewardship program coordinator. So very engaged in this work, and really appreciate the presentation today. I thought we got a great overview of good science on through the CEAP program about what's working and where, and how we can better understand it, as well as another framework to the ACPF for how we can do some sort of watershed scale assessments. And I think we talked really great about one or a couple of pillars of the monitoring, but I just want to kind of reiterate those to kind of bring us home again, is that, Levi brought up that there's really 4 pillars of monitoring in VSP. We want to monitor participation levels. We want to monitor the viability of ag. We want to monitor the implementation of best management practices. And the 4th is their effectiveness on the landscape. And I think we got a really great idea of how we can, better evaluate the effectiveness. But I also wanted to share something from Lisa's presentation too about how we can fill gaps in that effectiveness monitoring with work on BMP implementation. I think where we have data gaps, or where collecting the data is particularly challenging or costly, there are other tools, and I think this really applies to VSP where that the data is lacking. We can track BMP implementation and where that's occurring in the watershed, and use current or past watershed assessment plans to help guide that. So where we know we need riparian management, or we know where we have important salmon reaches, or where we know where we have important nutrient issues, we can target BMPs and use that to help tell the VSP story where we might have gaps. So I just wanted to share that while today really focused on getting better data, and I really appreciate that, I think there's a lot of opportunity as well to use existing plans and programs to capitalize on a program like VSP so that we can better track the information we already have to help fill that information gap. So just wanted to add that context, and thanks again for the great presentations today.
And Sean, I'll just respond quick. I think the approach you just described is kind of what we hope for in terms of tracking outcomes from some of our conservation initiatives in NRCS, like the National Water Quality Initiative, for example, or RCPP projects. So, NWQI specifically calls for having a watershed assessment at the beginning of the project and provides funding for that the first few years, if there is not one that exists. And then sort of the next step is the implementation funding. And, the report out would be sort of, how have you addressed the implementation needs defined by the assessment through essentially the tracking of the what and the where against that watershed assessment. So we feel like that's a really, more feasible, I guess, anywhere in any watershed, because as you noted, and we discussed with Levi, there are lots of assessments that probably already exist for these watersheds, particularly ones that have TMDLs, I'm sure. And then, it's very doable and very important, I think, information and knowledge for the planners working in the watershed or in the fields to know, well, how far have we come with meeting some of those implementation needs that were defined by the assessment. So regardless of, rigorous monitoring, you can get a good sense if you're on track, I guess, with your conservation efforts to making a difference through that kind of approach. So super glad to hear that you took that away from today's discussion and kind of reaffirming the approach and the work that you all have already started under the VSP. Thanks.
Yeah, just if I could, one more on that issue. I felt like I was seeing like that idea of triangulation to kind of help tell the story. Like we may have some gaps in certain types of data here or there, but when you sort of put all the pieces together, do you get some kind of consistent theme about how things are going? And I think from my standpoint, I feel like it's really important for our VSP stakeholders to hear that about expectations, what expectations you have of your monitoring. I feel like it's unlikely that every time you're going to get super clear results just from one type of, just from water quality monitoring, for example, like, Lisa mentioned in her presentation. For one, it's expensive and time consuming. It can be, depending on how intensive you're doing it. And even if it's done perfectly, you may get a sense of what's going on, but you would have a stronger story to tell if you can triangulate that with implementation data and some other, like that great example where you had data from the lake showing trends over time, plus you had data from the tributaries about when, pre and post, when you really started ramping up activities. And I think that tells a pretty good story, given that we're working in at a watershed scale where there's a lot of noise and a lot of complexity. So, and just I'm curious. I think Bill and Brian from the commission are on. I wondered if you had any thoughts about how this might relate to VSP or CREP or anything else. Sorry to put you on the spot. You don't have to, but. Brian says no thoughts. And also I want to give some space for some of the NRCS staff in Washington. I don't know if you have any input or thoughts on anything we heard this morning? Bill Eller from Washington State Conservation Commission said you covered well how this relates to VSP. Okay, so that sounds good. Glad to hear that. Thanks for the feedback, Bill. Any other burning questions from folks? Thoughts on next steps? Any ideas for next steps that folks might have? Okay. Brad Johnson says, great presentations. Thanks. Thank you, Brad. Glad you could join us. I can say that, oh, looks like Sean's got his hand up. Go ahead, Sean.
I just had a quick another thought. I just wanted to ask about the ACPF. Is it for translating that to Washington? Is it a pretty straightforward approach? Is it just uploading some GIS base layers and then you kind of run a machine, or is it require a little bit more technological savviness? I'm just thinking about how some counties might be able to incorporate this and what we can do as state actors in this to help with that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Sean. I'll start and then I'll toss it over to Robin. I think, in an ideal world, we would take the data that are available and then process them using utilities, or maybe a bigger, utility. The utilities tool is really for a Huck 12 watershed. I think it's depending on what the state's really interested in, if that's the scale or if it's a larger scale. There are ways to do it, but it's not quite as simple, I don't think, as just pushing some buttons. And that's where I'll turn it over to Robin.
Okay. So I'm the manager of the GIS facility at Iowa State University, which is where the ACPF the hub is housed out of. And like Emily said, I'm the head of the tech team. And our first conversation with Levi, some of the action items we had discussed would potentially be find some pilot locations to actually create the core data, to test the tools, see how it runs, see what the results look like. And since one would have some local knowledge, see how that applies, and then maybe what tweaks would need to be made. Like Emily said, the toolbox is set up to run it at the Huck 12 level. And I would hope that might actually work well for the pilot anyway. Yes, there are ways to essentially fool the tools to use a larger spatial extent, but it does require some GIS manipulation, and you really need to know how the tools operate before you try to do that. The field boundary editing, or let's just say preparation, might be the biggest piece, the most time-intensive piece maybe. But there is really great field boundary data that we've seen, and Levi showed a screen capture of that in his talk. I think the hub is here ready to help a small group of folks who I think would be interested to want to try to prepare that data. At least one of those people has to know ArcGIS Pro fairly well. And the others, if you're interested, and the local knowledge of the area where we would choose 1 or 2 Hucks, that's up to, you Washington folks. We're happy to help walk people through it, help you set it up, help, organize the DEM and all the other data that needs to be prepped. But someone on the Washington side needs to be the person who says, I'll be your GIS person, and I think we should do priority, say these 2 watersheds.
appreciate that, Robin and Emily. I think it sounds like Levi's already on that with you guys, which that sounds awesome. And I think pilot counties sounds like a good idea. So I'll look forward to learning more from Levi and supporting it how I can. Thank you.
Sure.
I just
Like
had
Levi, not
one
Levi?
comment to, oh, I'm sorry, Robin.
No, go ahead, Greg.
Oh, I was just thinking if there were a couple of Huck 12s out there where sort of similar conservation practices are in place, things like that Emily showed on her slides, like grass waterways or contour buffers, something similar enough that the tool is already, built to run, that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like because Washington is so diverse too, so I'll have to think about where that might be. I know in a general sense, I think nutrients are an issue in more than one watershed over here. So I think there's that overlap already. But yeah, maybe we can kind of keep it loose. I like the idea of the proof of concept, work with one or two, kind of see how things go for counties or watersheds or districts that have an interest. And then we could also, kind of iterate, once we got through one or two of those and maybe present it back out to the group and kind of roll with it that way. I think that might be a fruitful way to do it too. But like Robin said, we are lucky in the sense that we have really good data out here. And she mentioned the farm boundaries being like one of the things we'll have to deal with. I think the good news on that is it's really good data, which is why, but it's so good that Brad says, pick me. Yeah, we can talk, Brad, we'll talk. I guess that would be the next thing. I'm not sure how to, I guess folks maybe could email me, or I think you got hopefully maybe got some contact info from the slides too. I'm not sure if you want to just reach out to ACPF directly, Brad, for example, or CC me or something like that. But at any rate, yeah, I think we have all the data in place. You saw the core data sets, and it's like elevation and the crop types and all that type of stuff. I think we have basically all that we need in terms of the foundations, and then it will just be, it would be a matter of customizing it to the local context, based on the local knowledge, based on the local need, that sort of ground up approach. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there, and yeah, just really appreciate everybody's time this morning. Brad, I see your hands raised.
Can you hear me, Levi?
I sure can.
Yeah, so we've got 1.7 million acres in a WIRA watershed out here for reporting on, and we've got 2 paired watershed studies, one in the north part of the county and one in the south part. And it's really, there's some, you can draw some comparisons to other watersheds, but it's just really challenging. I really appreciated how expensive this can be. Brian Cochran, I think, still on here, so you want the question, but and you can do cheaper monitoring, but in all actuality, it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and then the analysis of it all, and it gets expensive quick. So I can't say enough, Levi, for putting this together, and for those of you back east that have provided a good presentations on what's being done. And I would just ask, maybe Levi, who is our local contact with NRCS, and if that could be sent out to us. And I appreciate you've always worked well with us and got us in contact, but some of this stuff, whether it's applicable even to the state of Washington directly, or if it's going to take a long time for it to be available. So that was my only question, and thanks again.
Sure, thanks for that, Brad. I think the best in terms of connecting would be with the ACPF directly, or possibly with the CEAP folks. I don't think there's a bunch of capacity right now, although correct me if I'm wrong, Bobby, I don't think there's enough capacity right now for NRCS Washington to get super involved in this at this point, is my understanding. But if you want, maybe we can kind of email or talk offline and work on connecting folks that way. And then also just, so Brad is in Whitman and Garfield counties, which is south of Spokane near WSU. So when you talked, Lisa, in your talk about Jan Boll and that diagram you showed of the works of Jan is a professor at WSU. He and some of his postdocs and grad students works with the Palouse Conservation District, which is where Brad works. And so they have already kind of worked on some CEAP-like projects with Ryan Boylan, doing some of the like critical source zone mapping and stuff like that. So that actually might be a nice way that might be a good starting point. Maybe we can talk offline. And if others are interested too, I just encourage you to reach out to me or the folks who presented here this morning. So we're approaching 11:50. I feel like the questions are starting to taper down. Does anybody have any other burning questions they'd like to ask before we wrap up for today, or any final thoughts or comments? Okay, not hearing any. I'm just gonna extend another big thank you to the ACPF folks and to Lisa for taking time to put your presentations together and to present to us and all the cool work you've done. Really, really appreciate it. And then thanks all of you who showed up to listen and participate and ask questions the day after a 3-day weekend. Super appreciate that too. Looking forward to continuing to have discussions around these themes, and I guess stay tuned for more. And
Everybody,
yeah,
we will get the presentations and the recording of this webinar posted. And I can send that out to this list of folks that joined us today, and it'll be on the CTD website as well. You can pass it on to folks who might not have been able to join today or just revisit some of the things we did today.
I'd just like to say thanks for inviting us, Levi and Dan, and for folks for attending. This is great. We love to talk about ACPF, so feel welcome to reach out to us with any questions.
awesome. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.